Word component as well as a PowerPoint component. So what I plan on doing is getting to the slides and then walking us through an exercise that I quite enjoyed when I was in seminary. Last week we spoke of Paul's writing to Timothy about the orders of the church. Do you remember what the structure was last week that we talked about? How was the apostolic age, as it's called, of the church organized? Anybody remember?
The apostles were the ones who actually were like they saw Jesus.
Right.
And then Paul had his conversion where he saw Jesus. So that was the apostles and their teachers. And then they couldn't do it all, so they had leaders who did it, and they were given different tasks, and Paul was sending out Timothy and Titus, who were converts that he had converted, and he was telling them the need of the characteristics for the pastors and the deacons. And the churches were small in homes, and that was how it all started.
Okay.
It rose up from there.
Sounds good. Anybody want to add anything else? So what we talked about last week was in the apostolic, hey everybody, in the apostolic order and era, after Christ had died and was resurrected, those who were considered apostles and teaching the faith were those who had an account of the resurrection and the witnessing of Christ. And they would go around spreading the good news, the gospel, to all of these areas in the Roman Empire. And as they would do that, what they found is that in these house churches, because remember, the church was not the synagogue, right? The church was in homes of Greeks, of Jews, of Roman citizens, etc. And so in these homes and communities within the different area of the Roman Empire, they would set up churches. And as Paul is going on and the other apostles and establishing churches, they began to get so many of them that they had to establish elders in the church and deacons. And we saw that in Acts 6. Remember when we were talking about the widows and how they were all upset that some weren't able to get into the feeding line and some were. And Paul at the end of that said, well, look, we're going to establish the order of deacon to people to serve this community. And do you remember who the first deacon of the church was? Stephen, exactly, Stephen. And so during this time, you had the apostle as the head of everything. Then you had their elders who were pastors, head of the homes. And then you also had deacons, which were serving those and assisting. And then you had the saints. What were the primary roles of the elder? What was actually the number one primary role of an elder? Do you remember? To teach. Exactly. It was to teach. They were to teach, they were to lead, they were to pray, and they were to shepherd the people. And what was the primary role of deacons? Do you remember? Service, right? Service, right? Serving in all of the areas of the church. And so this is kind of how the church structure went. The apostles went around establishing churches and teaching, and then they would find elders to be in these communities that will further teach and sound doctrine and lead and shepherd. And then they had deacons that would help to serve those communities. And so what we also talked about was the structure of the United Methodist Church is today we have two orders that you can be ordained into. You can be ordained into the order of elder or the order of deacon. And as you see here, word and service are things that they share together. But for the elder, we are called to order as well as to sacrament. And what order here means is order the life of the church in the sense of being pastor of the church, administrator, and leader. And sacrament is overseeing communion and baptism. And then here, deacons, we've added compassion and justice, which are things that elders should be, doing. But the idea is most deacons are those that bridge the gap between the church and the world. So it's kind of changed a little bit. Yes, sir.
Would you give us the definition that you gave a while ago of the apostle? I'm interested in that.
Yes.
It's somebody that was
Mhm.
ordained by God or Jesus?
So when it comes to the apostles, the historic understanding of a person who could be qualified as an apostle was someone who either had a first-hand account of Jesus walking with him, one of the disciples, or it was someone who had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And so that's the only way during that time that you can be an apostle, initially at least.
What about somebody that observed the crucifixion?
Maybe. I can see that being an apostle. But at that time, the apostles were a select group of folk. You knew who the apostles were, in essence. Paul, an apostle of Christ, Peter, and the others. And so we talked about these as orders, and then we also, when we talked about the structure, we said that our structure is kind of similar to this, but now instead of having apostles and deacons instead of deacons being under elders, which you have, I should have put the slide up here, is you have deacons and elders simultaneously side by side, and then you have district superintendents that oversee a district, and then you have an episcopal area or a bishop that oversees all of that. Does anybody remember what district we're in the Texas Annual Conference?
East Texas.
Well, you're right. So in one regard, you're right. Our conference is the eastern side of Texas, but our district within this conference is considered Southwest District. Southwest District.
Sounds like that.
Mhm.
We're in the east, we're in the west.
All right. So today, what we're going to talk about is our widows, God's household, the structure of a household for a Christian family, as well as Paul's charge to Timothy. And so we open our Bible to 1 Timothy 5. This is really the scriptures that refer to widows. Titus kind of is a little different, a little nuanced in a way. But Timothy says this. So Timothy says in chapter 5, 1 Timothy 5, in verse 3, give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, these should learn, first of all, to put their religion into practice by caring for their own family, and so repaying their parents and grandparents, for this is pleasing to God. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. Give the people these instructions so that no one may be open to blame. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. No widow may be put on the list of widows unless she is over 60 through Social Security in the Bible, has been faithful to her husband, and is well known for her good deeds, such as bringing up children, showing hospitality, washing the feet of the Lord's people, helping those in trouble, and devoting herself to all kinds of good deeds. As for younger widows, do not put them on such a list. But when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. Besides, they get into the habit of being idle and going about from house to house. And not only do they become idlers, but also busybodies who talk nonsense, saying things they ought not to. These are the young widows. So I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. Some have, in fact, already turned away to follow Satan. And so this is kind of what we're going to look at for a little time here, because what Paul is writing to the church is about the widows. So in understanding all of this, what are some things that stand out to you in the text? This is going to be a very interactive class session. What are some things that stood out to you in that text?
We're really only talking to the older widows, not to the younger ones.
Right, right. So Paul makes a clear distinction between older widows and younger widows. And what he alludes to is that there's probably this role, or widow membership role that they have. And he is giving the qualifications for that. And so since we've separated younger and older, why do you think that Paul does not want a younger widow to be included in the church's membership role, if you will, for widows? Why do you think Paul does not want to include young widows as the formal widow?
He says they want to get married.
Want to get married? Yeah, get married.
Did women work back in those days?
They didn't get paid
I
for
mean,
it,
get paid.
They have to.
Yes, they did.
They did.
Early during this time, the first century, most women ran the household. So they oversaw the household affairs, and it wasn't until decades later that they actually began to own their own businesses. So by this time, they were very dependent upon other men to kind of help in their affairs. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
An older woman would have time to focus on the relationship with Christ, to be able to pray and spend all the time doing that. Where a younger one is going to be focused on having a family and all of those things. And that's where they wanted the focus to be. They wanted it to be
Right,
separated because this is your priority at this time.
right. Yes, ma'am.
in this very chapter, very paragraph right here, a younger widow, do not put them on such a list, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry, lest they bring judgment on themselves, because they have broken their first pledge. Then, he said that, and then down here he says, so I counsel younger widows to marry. Even though before that he says, they've broken their pledge and they've been condemned for it.
Mhm.
And then it got later on, he says, go ahead and marry.
Mhm.
It's kind of like, damned if you do and damned if you don't.
Mhm. So what do y'all think we are to do with that? The juxtaposition of verse 12, they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken the first pledge. And then when you get to verse 14, I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity for slander. How do we hold these two in tandem? They're in the same chapter,
Same paragraph.
same paragraph.
You only have to kind of look at what it means to break that pledge.
Okay.
If she's a widow,
Mhm.
that was through no means in most cases. She didn't do anything to make that happen. We're assuming that, but this gives plenty of someone who's been yeah, so what does that mean? I think that's, for me, that's the crux of it, because if her spouse died, and that in their historical perception is breaking the pledge, what does that really mean?
Mhm.
I mean, we're looking at it like a divorce, but, in God's eyes, maybe, I don't know, so that's my question. What is that, how is that different from that?
Mhm.
Yeah, so my Bible in the footnotes, so not the part that God wrote, says that pledge was that when the widows joined a group, they pledged to support the church and have a long-term celibate. So that pledge was not their marriage pledge, it was a pledge to the church.
Maybe like a grieving time, like a grieving period, where they're pledging that they need to grieve for like a year and then they can be married.
Right. So there's sometimes in a text, as we saw in Judges, there can be a place where we kind of run into a wall because it's difficult to hold the two together, and they've broken their first pledge. They brought judgment on themselves, and then now encouraging them to remarry. And so what I think about is, what is the first pledge, and who is passing the judgment? Because I think that the way we answer those two could inform the way that we see the whole situation. And so if the first pledge is their first pledge to Christ, that has a different context and element than if the first pledge is, say, to their husband or their husband's family. And then when he talks about judgment, if it's God's judgment, then there's a weightier sense of judgment than if it were the judgment of the Roman society. And so, just to give us a little bit of background, what actually happened in Roman structure for the family is that there was a thing called the pater familia. I'll actually just go to this slide now. The pater familia, if you want to say it in Latin. This is the head of a household. And actually, when we read in scripture that a woman shall cover her head, it's because, in a way, scholars will argue, is because in covering her head, she's showing that she belongs under the protection and family of this individual. And this individual here is not the husband per se, but it's the head of a family. So back in Roman society, fathers were really the heads of families, right? And then they had their sons who were married to a wife, and then they would have their children. And so this is the way that the structure was given. And so if you think about a pledge, what it could be is that if this woman, her husband has passed away, she still in a way belongs to this family. And her head is covered, if you will, by this individual. And so the pledge that she's made is to be his and to belong to this family, to produce children, in a sense. And so we could understand that first pledge as being a pledge to this family. Or if we look in the verse right before that, we see how the pledge is probably about Christ. Because when you read 11, as for the young widows, do not put them on such a list, for when their sensual desires overcome their dedication to Christ, they want to marry. Thus they bring judgment on themselves because they have broken their first pledge. So, one way that we can actually interpret this text is taking verse 11 and saying, if they're put on the list, then that seems that, as has been mentioned, there probably is some pledge or promise that they've associated themselves with. And being a true widow, they're dedicating themselves to God, which is what we see as part of the qualifications earlier. The widow who is really in need and left all alone puts her hope in God and continues night and day to pray and to ask God for help. That's verse 5. But the widow who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives, verse 6. And so this understanding is, I think, Paul arguing to the church. Listen, if y'all want to put people on this road to be a widow, you have to understand that now they're saying that they're pater familia, if you will, for lack of a better term, is God. Almost like nunnery, if you will. They're solely dedicating themselves to God. And so if a young widow comes into play, and she's young enough to remarry and to produce children, which was a high value in Roman society, if you place her on that list and she remarries, now she breaks the pledge that she made to God and to the church. That's one way we can interpret the text. Yes, sir.
Another factor that my study about was the fact that, that was a fairly small group of people at that time. And the woman becomes a widow, it's all full of potential husbands who are believers. And the temptation to marry outside to unbelievers, they take the husband's religion would be, again, breaking this pledge.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So what do y'all think of that? Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, the notes that I have in my Bible basically, when they become a widow, if they want the church to take care of them, they make a pledge to the church that they remain on. So if they break that pledge, this is what the verse is. And if they supported it by the church, so that pledge to be remain unmarried, so that to remarry would be to renounce that pledge. The younger widows might be tempted to desire to marry unbelievers and start from their faith. So the terms are very prompt about the fact that some of the right astray. The grave issue must be a view of remarriage to an unbeliever. So basically, they make a pledge when they became a widow to be taken care of by the church, as I understand it. So if you fool God, you've not broken that pledge. It's not the pledge that you had with your first husband.
Right, right.
So it encourages marriage.
Yes, sir.
One widower basically in the family, and if her husband passed away, the family around her take care of her
Right.
like they would if she did have her husband. So a lot of times, I guess they would even remarry within that family.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's very true. Because it goes back to this whole structure, that even though the husband is passed on and gone to glory, the wife still remains a part of this family. And so you're right, she could marry an uncle, she could marry a brother of her husband, all of that to stay within the family, because during that time, women then didn't have the same position of power that they do today. And so a lot of their support and their resources came from the family that they belonged to and not from their own individual enterprise, which we'll see a little bit later. Yes, ma'am.
And it goes back to the book of Ruth, wherever your people go,
Mhm.
I will follow, I will be with your people.
Mhm.
So maybe it's, making that commitment to that family, and then when it finally says you go off and get married, maybe that family releases them from
Mhm.
being underneath them, or marrying
Right.
them underneath them.
Right, that's true. So now if this woman would like to remarry, it would actually take the head of the families to agree to it. So she couldn't just go off and say, all right, my husband has passed. That used to be my family. Now I would like to marry again. And she had autonomy in that. And women at that time didn't really have autonomy or free will if they belonged to the family. It would actually take the head of that family to talk to another head of the family to agree to allow this marriage to happen, because her head was covered in a sense by the family she married into. Does that make sense? Yes, ma'am.
What's the significance of the bottom part where it says wife to daughter? What's different about that?
That was an error. Sorry. So it's supposed to be these are supposed to branch off to these three. It's not individual.
Oh, okay.
Sorry about that.
Marquise,
Yes, ma'am.
this is a great example of one reason why women right now fight, that I'm gonna let the young women work at it. But right here, then it goes on and talks about that if she doesn't marry, she gossips and busybody and saying things she ought not to. Do you really and truly think that women are the only ones who do that?
Right.
I tell you what, men gossip just as much as women, in fact, more so.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the men are always right.
Only because they've got the power behind them.
Right. So think about this. Okay. So let's think through this. In the Roman society, what would typically happen is after a young lady has reached puberty, she will then be ready to be married. And oftentimes she was married to an older man, because marriage at this time was not for love and for intimacy as we understand it today, or even compassion and feelings. Marriage was more of a political enterprise and an economic enterprise. So that if you were the head of a family and you had a daughter, you wanted to make sure the person she was married to had money and could support her and the family. So what would happen is typically these younger women would be married to older men. You're probably talking about a 14, 15-year-old married to somebody who's 28 or 30. Because in that society, the role that women played was to be childbearing and to take control of the household. Whereas it was the men who were to secure the finances and the wealth to provide for the family. And so young men didn't have as much money as older men, and younger women were better for childbearing than older women were in their societal standards. And so that's why you see young women and older men. The other thing too is if a man were famous in a sense and he had wealth, it was probably because he had some ties to the government and maybe was even a soldier of some sort. And so sometimes what would happen is actually a woman's husband would serve in the army, and then he would pass away, and now she's young, probably hasn't had a lot of children, and some of them may not even live, because the statistics show that, if I'm not mistaken, think by the age of 10, at least 50% of all babies born have died. 50%.
Age is 10.
By the age of 10, once a child was born until the time he reached 10, 50% of those babies had already passed. They had a high infant mortality rate. And what made it even crazier is if the head of that family did not see that child, that little infant, as suitable or as cream of the crop, he could just take him, put him outside his door, and leave him for dead, or take him and sell him into slavery because of the societal standards at that time.
That was the Roman Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
We're now talking about the Christian idea of family.
Right.
And I thought it was very interesting that they had a bunch that said, if you do not take care of your own family,
Mm-hmm. Right.
it's pretty strong.
So now let's switch backwards. Okay, so we have a good understanding of why Paul is encouraging younger widows to not be put on that list. Do we have a good understanding of why he's saying that? Okay. And do you understand why he's counseling younger women to marry? Okay, good. Now let's talk about this list that Paul brings up. Who qualifies to be an official widow and receive social welfare from the church?
That'd be 60 years old.
60 years old, okay, he sets that up.
You must love God and worship Him.
Okay, love God and worship Him.
Has been faithful to her husband.
Faithful to her husband, okay.
Brought up children in the faith,
Brought up children in the faith, okay. Anything else?
washing the feet of saints.
Washing the feet of saints. They could either be figuratively or literally. Serving others.
Marquise,
Yes, sir.
60 years of age back then,
Yeah.
quite old, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So that's eliminating a lot of people right there.
Yep,
Not very many left.
yep, that's true. So we could talk about that for a second. I'll try to make a note of it. But the age 60 is a limiting factor for a lot of people because they didn't live to the age that we live today. Life expectancy was probably 60 to 75, if I had to guess. What are some other qualifications for a widow? Anything else you see in the text?
No other family to take care of.
No other family to take care of them. Right. So Paul is instructing Timothy that the women who are to be official widows in the church ought to first of all be Christian. All those standards we named first before having no other source of resource were all Christian things. Raise your children up in the faith. Take care of your household. Serve others. Put your hope and your expectation and salvation into God. Those are the same things that elders and deacons were to be held to, those standards. And it's the same for widows. And so Paul is not differentiating, if you will, between how well one person should live in comparison to another. But what Paul is saying is this Christian standard should be lived among all of us so that we can choose elders from among our group, we can choose deacons, and also we can choose the women who will become widows. And the other thing that Paul brings out, as I mentioned, is the idea that in order for you to be a real widow, you have to, first of all, do all these things, but then your family is not able to take care of you. And so what does that mean to us that Paul is arguing? Why do you think Paul would say your immediate family cannot help is a qualification? Yes, sir.
So if you're a Christian family, that's, you're obligated to take care of your family members.
Right,
And that's,
right. Exactly.
So, I mean, if you're not willing to help, then the church probably will step in to take care of you with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're
Exactly.
really saying that why should the church as body, take care of this woman when she's got sons who can do it? Sons should be doing it.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you think the churches should be at fault for not helping these widows when they have family around that should be helping them?
No, because that means that the family's not following the Christian standards, if they have family.
But I think they're implying that the physical family and the church family are one and the same.
Should be.
right? So if everyone's Christian, they're all in the family, then the first group that would care for the widow would be her children and her immediate family, and if they're not there, then the rest of the family comes in.
I think one of the things we need to remember though is that, a lot of women were married pagans, and a lot of men maybe were married pagans too. So a pagan husband, when he died, the family may or may not, particularly if they're all pagans, they're not necessarily going to take care of the, the widow's wife.
Last thing, and then we'll move on. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that what Paul's saying here is let the church be the source of last resort.
Yeah.
And every other thing, because clearly they didn't have many resources. They couldn't have a general welfare system where everybody 20 years old or older can say, well, it's not going to marry out, it's going to live off the church. So they could sustain it. So they're preserving it for the ones that truly need it.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Everybody's making a good point, because if we look at verse 8, 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, it says, anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So couple that then with verse 16 that says, if any woman who is a believer has widows in her care, she should continue to help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. What Paul is arguing is that in this family structure, if there is a widow in the structure and there's a head of a family or there are other members of it, they should take care of their own. The family structure at this time, you shouldn't just let a woman who has no resources and all of that, a marginalized section of society, if you will, just be left all on her own. The family should be taking care of each other. And in a way, that would free up a lot of the space so that the church can actually take care of those who are really in need. For the widows who are out there without anything at all. So, for instance, if the church had $100 to give, and they can either give it to the widow who has members of her family still alive, especially older children, that can take care of them, or they had a widow over here who had nothing and nobody. What the church is saying is, well, we should give to them because you all, as Christian households, should be taking care of each other. Does that make any sense? And this goes back to Deuteronomy 24. If we turn to Deuteronomy 24, we can see that this whole thing about taking care of the widows in your family is something that continues throughout all of Scripture. So Deuteronomy 24, 17 through 21. It says, do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That is why I command you to do this. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from your trees, do not go over the branch a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. And we also see here in verse 14, 28 through 29, at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Since the early times of the faith, God has always had a heart for those who are marginalized, for those who are in great need. The fatherless, as well as the widow, had no overhead and protection. They had no way to sustain themselves because the culture at that time was women didn't work. Women stayed in the homes. They didn't provide for themselves. They had no resources. And so if a woman has lost her husband, if a son or daughter has lost their father, they're now out on the streets and need help from others. And so what God is saying, for those who are marginalized, when you go into your fields, don't go back a second time. Leave that for those people to come and to eat. So you take care of them.
But, you know, if they're not believers, they're out of luck, aren't they?
No,
No,
no.
No,
Deuteronomy just definitely said,
or so it covers everybody.
Foreigners, fatherless, and widows. All of those people should be able to come and to eat at the Lord's table. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, in those cultures, there was a total difference in the way that women and men
Mhm.
came together.
Mhm.
In fact, I met someone yesterday, and he was talking to me, and his marriage was arranged something like 35 years ago. And he did it ever since.
Mhm.
It was done within the family, it was a political thing,
Right,
family thing, and they made the arrangements.
exactly.
When a woman was brought into the family,
Mhm.
another brother or someone in that family would normally be responsible for that
Right.
widow. And so we look at it today, and
Mhm.
women have choices today, particularly in America.
Mhm.
And you think about it back then, and they really weren't the rulers or the masters of their house, so to speak.
Right. And what we see is different. Well, what we do see here in the text is that Paul is not against widows marrying. What Paul is against is making a pledge more so to God and to the church and then going back on that pledge. Because
Marrying outside the faith, remarrying outside the faith.
not specifically, it's just for him, when you say that you're a widow now and you belong to the church, you are dedicating yourself to the church as well as to God. And so that's the first pledge that you make. And to go back on that pledge, because you want to be married, I think is more so the point that Paul wants to make. Because I don't think Paul is saying you should, one, not remarry if you're a widow. And two, I think Paul celebrates marriages because he's done that in the scriptures before. One last thing, and then we'll move on to another section. Yes, sir.
I was gonna say, back in those days, if a man married a beautiful woman and brought her into the household, she belonged to that household.
Right. Mhm.
She didn't belong back in her old household. Even if it was to take your wife and be apart from your mother and father, well, really, you moved right in with them in their contact.
Right.
So the whole families were together in one unit
That's very
to
true.
begin with, in a normal case.
That's very true.
I thought that into that was simply the when he was explaining what he thought.
Mhm.
It's over on page 55.
Mhm.
Christian theology is closely bound up with guidelines for a healthy family living. You don't have to read very far between the lines of this passage to see where unhealthy ways of organizing the extended family might creep in,
Mhm.
and where strong guidelines will need to be provided.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
you can see where,
Yeah.
you know,
That's true. So what, one of the things that we're going to talk about is how Paul is encouraging Timothy to structure the family of Christians during this time. Because Christianity was a small sect of the religious tapestry of the Roman world. And in being a small sect, they had to look out for one another. And in meeting in each other's homes, in a way, you became part of each other's family. So the church was actually understood to be your extended family. But I want to do one thing before we move on, because I think this will be beneficial. In Deuteronomy, it said, foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows, take care of them. In Paul's writing to Timothy, he's addressing the widows, a social class of need. And so the question that I have for us here at Faith is, in this community, in our family, what are the needs that we see present in this community? If Paul were to write a letter to us, what need do you think he would address? Social need.
Well, the needs in Rosenberg with Fort Bend Hope, we address needs there.
Mm-hmm.
Educationally,
Okay.
we provide food at Thanksgiving for many families, I think.
Okay.
Are you specifically saying what needs for the community or
Healthy.
for the widows? And the sport?
What I'm saying is, what, I guess a better question is, what people group or group of people
Well, fathers, that's
would God be, do we find in our community as a need? The fatherless are
The
one,
homeless,
okay?
the lonely, single moms,
Single moms?
yes.
Single fathers too. Well, that is-
Mhm.
I think people that are just not in the church, period.
Okay, say more.
Huh?
You mean like non-Christians or,
Yeah, like they don't practice. They believe, but they don't.
okay? Any other people group or groups of people that we should be engaging with, kind of on the lines of social welfare, for lack of a better word? Like, we should be able to step in the gap and provide resources for them.
Children in abusive situations.
Okay? Okay.
What about, in our youth group, we have many teenagers whose families don't come to church, but through our youth group, they're learning and they come to church. So it would be teenagers in non-Christian homes, I guess.
Okay. So I wanna bring this more from a macro to a micro level. There is the evangelical side or evangelistic side of sharing the good news. There is that component. But what we're specifically speaking about, or Paul is specifically speaking about in this text, are the widows and the needs provided for them. And so in our community, in a very specific way, what do you think is a group of people that we should be keeping in mind to take care of? Sort of like we have single moms in our community, here in the church, as well as in the community at large. There are those who are fatherless. It's really those who have a social need. Anything else going on?
Well, just that we've failed, that these populations of groups have become so immense.
Mhm.
And yeah, you have Thanksgiving, you have Christmas Day, but you also have the other 360 some days.
Mhm.
And there's no church that has the capability to feed this population 3 meals a day, every day, and provide them with a roof and provide them with, so we resorted someplace back in our history, we turned it all over to the government because the church failed, family failed. And so now we have welfare, we have CPS for the abused, we have social security for the elderly, you know, and so it's great what we do achieve with our church,
Mhm.
but it's not like we can attack a certain population and provide everything that they need because their population is just immense now.
Right.
Partially because some people would say we're living too long. We never expected to have this many people that are this old and
Right.
and need things.
You know who you're talking to in here?
Yeah, I was really moved when Vicki and I went to Egypt. And you're looking at Cairo and you see all of these houses that are almost one room wide and they go up second floor, third floor, fourth floor. And what you see on the roof of all of those houses are large wrought iron rods all over the place. And it's because it's like Herb said, when the son married, the son didn't go after the house. The father, the parents built another one on the house, and that's where he and his wife came to live.
Right.
But the Egyptian family was pretty smart economically, because if he left wrought iron open on, and it's still to this day, on the roof of that home, the only places that have to pay property tax are buildings that are complete. My house is not complete. See all of the wrought iron sticking out. So then the next son marries, and they build a third one. They put the wrought iron on that roof. And so they never pay property tax because the building will never be completed.
Right.
But the family will remain, you know, one, and you won't have people on welfare, and you won't have people on the other things, because the family is still taking care of the children, is still taking care of the elderly. And you think, we Americans think we know we're so smart and we do everything so right, but we have so many other countries' culture that they just never left the word to begin with.
Right. It's a good point. Thanks for sharing that. That's a great point. So when I started this exercise, what I was thinking of is some specificity of missional focal points. So, for instance, an example could be we do a lot of Kairos work, and as persons are exiting the prison system and they enter into the real world, some of those individuals may not have family to support them. And so what would it look like if our church partnered with agencies or organizations to help with reentry? Or in North Rosenberg, where we have a pocket of poverty, looking at the statistics, and some persons there may be illegal in our country, what would it look like if we created a center where they could come to learn English, as well as their children to get some help with their homework, because English is a second language. And that's where Fort Bend Hope was working on. So saying all that to say that as a church, we're always charged to take care of the people that we're here with, but also those in our community. And so the question that kind of comes to my mind is now, who are those that are on our road that we take care of, right? The widows are on a roll at the church that Timothy was at. And so each local church ought to have people on its roll that it takes care of. And make sure it's the ministers like the fatherless, like the widows, like the foreigners in Deuteronomy, who can just come by the fields and eat because God has blessed this country so much. So these are just some things I wanted us to take a swing at. So I thank y'all for indulging me. The last thing I want to talk about is...
Can I make a quick advertisement?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
The Carol Vance Unit, we just celebrated 22 years of the religion program at the Carol Vance Unit. I remember the day that the class 1 got off of the prison buses, and they would read it and say, there aren't any closed doors here. You're not going to wear chains here. But for 2 years, you're going to be here immersed in the Bible and things like that. Well, at this 22-year celebration just 2 weeks ago, we celebrated Carol Vance, that the unit is named after. We celebrated Prison Fellowship and Chuck Colson. We celebrated Alpha, and we celebrated Kairos. And we particularly celebrated the fact that the men that got off the bus now are class 71.
Wow.
71 times 200 people have come to the Carol Vance to be put into that program. And while there's not families that take the faith, there's church mentors to take this class. And the recidivism rate in Texas, which is, was he rearrested for another crime within 3 years after release, recidivism was 75%. The recidivism in Carol Vance Unit is about 5%. between 5 and 8%.
Wow.
So, but I was, of course, I cry a lot. But I was brought to tears that class 71 even over there.
Wow.
And that was started right here in our family at the Jester prison. And that's something to celebrate. In the commercial.
And are there other prisons looking at that, other states looking at that too,
Well,
or not?
that's enough. The U.S. Supreme Court, in their wisdom, after the program was about 5 years old, came down and reiterated that the Constitution says you cannot mix church and state. Therefore, you cannot use a single dollar of appropriated tax money for a religious program. So those programs now are all privately funded through people that donate estates, people that donate dollars, people that do the mentorship program, and then prison fellowship nationwide. Prison fellowships in 93 prisons now, but there's only 2 prison programs, Carol Vance and one in Minnesota, because of the Supreme Court saying you can't use state money. Right.
So that's a perfect example of how we as a church could take care of those in our mission field, and the impact that you can see. I don't know if you understand the depth of that, but to say that the state recidivism rate is 75, so after people get released within 3 years, they commit another crime that gets them back in. 75% of all of those who are released do just that. So only 25% in the last 3 years of being out actually don't do anything wrong and do well in acclimating back to society. So to turn it on its head and to say that 95% of the people who go through that program don't commit another crime in the next 3 years that puts them back in prison is groundbreaking. That's something that
It's like, if this was a pyramid, we know that the pyramid has been there for 3,000 to 5,000 years because of the solid base that it sits on. But a program like you're talking about, and programs like Good Hope, it's a pyramid. It's upside down. It's sitting on its point. And you say, well, how long can this pyramid stand with a foundation that's only on the point, and it not collapse one way or collapse the other way? And the only thing we've got to do is build that point bigger and bigger and bigger. And maybe 1,000 years from now, these programs will be like the pyramids that are still in Egypt. They will be so solidly based, right, with all of us doing our part, that they'll always be there.
That's a great point. Yeah. I want to move us to our last section here. We can turn to Titus chapter 2. I'm going to read kind of about the encouragement that Paul gives to Titus, as well as to the household of God. Paul writes in chapter 2, you, however, must teach what is appropriate to sound doctrine. Teach the older man to be temperate, worthy of respect, self-controlled, sound in faith, sound in love, and sound in endurance. Likewise, teach your older women to be reverent in the way they live, which is kind of like holy, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. Then they can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. Similarly, encourage the young men to be self-controlled. In everything, set them an example by doing what is good. In your teaching, show integrity, seriousness, soundness of speech that cannot be condemned, so that those who oppose you may be ashamed because they have nothing bad to say about us. Even teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them, not to talk back to them, and not to steal from them, but to show that they can be fully trusted, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God, our Savior, attractive. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people, It teaches us to say no to ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in this present age, while we wait for the blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all wickedness and to purify for himself a people that are his very own, eager to do what is good. These then are the things you should teach, encourage, and rebuke with all authority, and do not anyone despise you. And so what we see in these verses in this passage is Paul is arguing for Titus to encourage the people to be upstanding citizens, to be people of the faith, and to live into your duty of being a citizen of this country, if you will. That's why he's arguing for women to oversee their households, which is something women did, to be subservient to their husband in the sense of the husband is the head, which is something they did. He even encouraged the women to teach, pushing forth something a little progressive for the time. But what Paul is arguing is this is how everyone should conduct themselves. You ought to be self-controlled in all that you do. You ought to be reverent and holy in the ways that you behave. And I think that those same things that he taught then are the same thing that we can hear today. Even when he talks about a slave, the reason he's saying these things to the slave is because he wants the slave to live as a Christian so it can reflect the God that he serves, which is why he says in verse 10, don't steal from them, but show that they can be fully trusted, the slaves, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God, our Savior, attractive. As we say today, all of us in this room are sometimes the first Bible that people will actually read. And so it's important for us to have a certain standard of living in this society that reflects the God that we serve. And so I think that this point is a little straightforward, but do y'all have any questions about this before we do our last opinion?
When you mentioned slaves in here, was that just considering that time of class, like the women did this and slaves was just yet?
Yep. Slaves, it was, I couldn't add it to the structure here, but if you were prominent in society and kind of wealthy, you had slaves. So that was just a way of life back then.
And then the disciples weren't about changing that just quite yet, like freedom and stuff, that was way later. It was just a way of life.
I would argue so, because what he does say is, I forgot where, but he, in another letter, addresses masters as well as slaves. So what he tries to create is that even within this caste system, if you will, masters, you ought to still respect the humanity of your slaves. And slaves, you still ought to respect your masters as in having the sense of authority over you, almost like a governor. Because at this time, during this study, this is actually teaching me a lot about Paul's mindset. And what I would almost want to argue is that Paul is trying to push the envelope as much as he can, but he's not trying to push it too much to where it causes ridicule and society to want to get rid of all of the Christians because they're doing too much. You know what I mean? Like Paul is arguing for to stay with the structure, but a few small changes here and there. Because what he does not want to do, in my opinion, is to get Christianity even more oppressed.
And Rome is still there.
Right, and Rome is still there because remember, it did not become a Christian, a statewide religion, sorry. Christianity did not become a statewide religion until about 2.5 centuries later. So up until that point, they were being martyred, they were being persecuted, they went through a period of being accepted, and then a new emperor comes in that persecutes them. You had the big fire in Rome, I think in the 80s.
Nero.
Yeah, Nero. There we go. Yep. So all of this is happening, and I think what Paul is trying to do is to say, all right, y'all, let's keep with what we hold as scripturally true, and let's live into these standards as much as we can, so that we can reflect the God we serve without causing too much disruption. And I think later, once it actually became, Christianity evolved to actually become a statewide religion and had a lot of people, then that's when we began to see the more formalized changes and stuff.
Marquise,
Yes.
in those days in the slave class,
Mhm.
it was almost in some ways, it was a good thing because they took, those people who owned the slaves took care of them. And if one of them died, they took care of the widow, and they didn't throw them out on the street. So they, in a perverted way, I guess, they provided a service for society. They took care of those people in the homes that would have, that were nice to people. I mean, you know,
Right.
abusive homes, they're leaving their lives and kids and they're leaving the slaves, but in the good homes, they were probably good to the slaves. Is that a correct thing to say?
I think that there were some social benefits to being a slave, in the sense that now you were provided food to eat, a place to sleep.
And care when you were sick and stuff.
But at the same time, you were still a slave, no matter how good it got. And then two, it really depended on your master as well. And I think that's why Paul is arguing to these households to be these type of people, so that not only are you treating your family right, but you're treating those that are your slaves. And he even writes the letter to Philemon, where he argues that Onesimus, my friend whom I met in prison, take care of him as a brother, for I consider him that now. And so what Paul is trying to do is not upset the equilibrium, upset the structure too much, but trying to make changes from within it so that we can see the benefits of Christ shown. If that makes any sense.
It was not only a Roman atmosphere, but it was also Jewish.
Right.
So you have this strong Jewish tradition going on.
Right.
And the Jews had slaves.
Right.
And it wasn't considered demeaning. In fact, we did in Judges, you know, about this man who sold himself into slavery because he needed that.
Right.
So it was just a
The last thing I want to do, we have 5 minutes here. I think we can make this happen. In chapter 5, the first line, 1 Timothy chapter 5, the first line that we read is, do not rebuke an older man harshly, but exhort him as if he were your father. Treat younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters with absolute purity. If you were to, in a way, these were Paul's letters to Timothy, how to stay out of trouble, right? But if we could take a second to think about, and then go around the room, if you were to write a letter to a young pastor about how to counsel, how to protect yourself, those sorts of things, what would you say to a young pastor in ministry today? Because this is what Paul is saying in chapter 1. When you come to speak to an old man, don't do it harshly. Revere him as a father. Because Timothy has a level of authority over the people. When you come to a younger man, treat him as a brother. When it comes to older women, treat him as a mother. And then when it comes to younger women, do it as a sister with absolute purity. So, if you were to say, if we were to start off by saying, dear young preacher, make sure to, we'll be the first clause.
Hang in there.
Make sure to what I'm saying?
Hang in there.
Okay. And, all right. What's another thing?
Have patience.
Patience.
Have patience, stay holy. What's something
I
else?
would say calmness and compassion. Calm when you're
Mm-hmm.
talking.
All right.
No one wants to hear something.
Listen,
Okay.
Listen.
I know how this is going to get. Everybody's going to just start doing that, shout and answer, which is fine. But let's do it in an order to make sure everybody gets done. No, y'all are fine. Y'all are fine. I just recognize that we'll be here till 12:20. So let's see. Have you said anything yet?
Empathy.
Empathy?
Yeah.
Okay. let's think about clauses. Stay calm, well, stay holy and calm.
Yeah.
And calm. Have empathy. Okay, let's continue down the line. If you haven't gone already. Okay, this is yours. Can we end it here or you want to start another sentence?
Never be alone.
This is yours. Never be wrong. This is yours. Would you like to add anything to it?
George? I think that the humble and servant is good.
Okay. So we can say remain humble and serve. Okay. Next, would you like to add something? Make a new sentence? Humble, okay. Next,
Listen more than talk.
okay. Okay. All right. Next person, would you add something to this or start a new sentence?
I think listen,
Okay.
I think it's one of the most important things for a new preacher, even if he's not an old, young one, is before he does anything, listen and find out what the culture of the congregation is. You know, walk in and then try to make them different. You know, find out. You try to change everything all at once, and you're gonna find out that you're wrong.
Right. All right. Next person.
I might say that, dear pastor, we love you.
Okay.
You know, sometimes you need to know that.
Okay. Next down the line.
You.
Me? It's, necessary to have a good head of hair.
All right. Next down the line. Do you want to add to it or you want to add a sentence?
Actually, I'd say you need a good sense of humor.
Okay. Do you want me to say that or have a good hair here?
You can take one.
Okay. Good hair. I'll read it afterwards.
Oh my gosh.
Faith?
All right, who's next? Let's see. We'll go down the line.
Okay, I would say, take care of yourself and your family,
Okay.
or, you know, don't neglect,
You know,
you know,
Yeah.
don't neglect your own family.
All right. Okay, next person.
Watch some old episodes of Bobby Knows Best.
Okay.
1950s, 50s, I idealized family structure.
Okay. Next.
Be open-minded to new ideas and new perspectives.
Be open to new ideas and perspectives.
Perspectives.
Perfect. Anyone else?
Okay, and I guess on the opposite side of what Chris just said, as I, through the years, served on church boards and committees, I found that there were quite older people that maybe weren't as educated, maybe they weren't involved in business at the time, so they weren't up on the newest way of doing everything, but there was a wisdom there that education and money or nothing else could buy. The wisdom of some of the older people was a priceless resource for the church.
So wisdom from elders is priceless. Is that right? Is that what you would say?
Yep.
Okay.
The ones that have been there and done that.
Okay. Next.
Love the diversity diversity of the body of Christ and don't think we have all the answers. And realize the Holy Spirit will work with all of you.
All right, that's a lot, Miss.
Yeah.
All right, so let's pick one of them. Let's pick one of them. What would you say? You can pick one of them. What would you say?
Just trust the Holy Spirit.
Trust the Holy Spirit? Believe you? Okay. Next.
Say, don't get distracted from the word.
Okay.
I think we already had humility on
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. All right, next. I think we're jumping across now.
We're gonna go near accountability.
We'll jump to you.
I'd say that for a young preacher to know your audience.
Yeah.
Okay. 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 Next.
And say be prayerful and not neglect your own spiritual.
Okay. Okay.
Remember, you don't have all the answers.
Okay. All right, next.
This is similar to me, I think. Make sure you ask them questions you understand.
All right, next.
Be patient and live, and listen well. Be patient and listen well.
Okay.
I think preach with conviction. I know some pastors that
George is not our
I did them all better.
Okay, next.
Over judgmental, that's the clip. Okay,
Did you say that?
I'm gonna read it out for us. All right,
I
next
just
one.
published it for our next class.
Yeah, I should have passed it around. What was y'all to that?
Just remember you're human. That's a lot to live up to.
Okay. And then last one.
And in closing, pray.
Good. That's what the Holy Spirit comes out from you. So, as a class, this is what we said. If we were to write a letter to a young preacher, we would say, dear young preacher, make sure to hang in there, have patience, stay holy and calm, and have empathy. Remain humble and serve, and make sure to listen more than talk. Before you act, learn the culture of the church, or you're gone. Dear pastor, we love you. It's necessary to have a good head and good humor. Don't neglect your own family. Watch a few episodes of Family Knows Best. Be open to new ideas and perspectives. Wisdom from elders is priceless. Trust the Holy Spirit will lead you. Don't be distracted from the word. Know your audience, young preacher. Be prayerful and don't neglect your own spiritual growth. Remember, you don't have all the answers. Make sure you ask enough questions to understand. Be patient and listen well. Over-judgmentalist is a cliff. Remember you're human, and the closing prayer.
That's a pretty good.
You've done every one of them.
So, again, thank y'all for coming. I enjoy this. I think this is a good message. And remember that even though the church then was different than the church today, there still remains tenets of the faith for us to live holy, to have self-control, to be reverent, and to live for Christ in such a way that those outside of our family want to know, how can I become a cousin and a son of the Most High God? Amen.